Doom Patrol Episode 5 is here, titled Youth Patrol. We get to learn more about Immortus, so let's jump into the review and breakdown. Welcome to NonStopAntonio, where I talk about everything nerdy. I love Marvel, DC, and anime, and if you do too, I hope you enjoy this video. In this episode, we get some good character development from Madame Rouge and Jane, and on top of it, we learn about what Immortus is and where he's coming from, in a sense. Plus, we get some interesting stuff going on with Larry this episode as well with Mr. 104. So let's start off with Larry and Mr. 104, because this was probably the shortest part of the episode, cutting back and forth between our main storyline, and this is more of the side storyline going on. Because Larry's going to find Mr. 104 because he still has Keeg in him. Because in episode 3, the negative spirit flew into Mr. 104 at the very end there, and I thought it was just getting them out of it, but it turns out that he went with him, and he hasn't been with Larry since. And it's interesting because as Larry's getting closer and closer to them, he starts to relive Mr. 104's memories. He sees that while he was trying to manipulate the elements in the experimentation process, he ends up killing everyone in the room, which is similar to when Larry was getting experiments done and they took off his protective gear, which the radiation would poison everyone in the room as well, which they also showed. And Mr. 104 put his whole body in lead so that he could touch Larry and look at him face to face. Which is really interesting. It also gives me vibes that they're gonna fall in love or something along those lines, because Mr. 104 can touch Larry by turning his skin into lead. Larry can actually have someone he can talk to, be with, and actually show his real self to, because he's not gonna die from radiation poisoning. And then we find out the whole reason Mr. 104 was helping Dr. Janice was because he had a pledge to Immortus, because his powers are out of control at the moment, and if they keep growing and getting worse and worse to control, it can cause a mass extinction event. I'm assuming by the way he changes the elements around him, he would cause some kind of explosion or reaction that could change air and not make it breathable, or change water not be drinkable, or something along the lines like that that could cause a mass extinction. Or he might just blow up and cause like a giant nuclear explosion or something like that. So another reason he's working with Immortus is so that Immortus can fix that, which is really interesting. And except Larry says he can help him, and then Larry gets taken by scissors cutting through reality, which I feel like we've seen before, but I'm honestly drawing a blank and I can't remember. But I'm sure we'll find out next episode, because Larry just got taken, and he's not even with the rest of the team. Larry seems to go off on his little adventures and disappear quite often, and then they all finally meet up again in the oddest of places. That covers Larry's story, so let's talk about the main Immortus plot now, because Willoughby comes back after we saw him in episode 1, telling the Doom Patrol that Immortus is going to rise. Immortus is an old god, the end of days, and is an interdimensional deity. So it's seeming like Immortus is not an actual person per se, but more of a god. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, and when he does come back, how powerful he'll truly be. Because he's not that comic book general, he's something else. And I like how this also makes Madame Rouge, who, remember, the Immortus project while she was working for the ant farm. Because the whole point of that Immortus project was to make people immortal. Which, yeah, goes toe-to-toe, makes sense. And it turns out that Niles Calder also figured out how to make immortality. And his immortality is the Doom Patrol. Because Larry, Rita, Cliff, and Jane all have pieces inside of them that make them immortal. He shaved off a bit of the stone that made himself and Mr. Nobody immortal, and made the team also immortal, which is really interesting and also makes a lot of sense, because this entire time it kind of made you wonder why Larry, Rita, Cliff, and Jane were all alive, because they were all born in different time periods in the 1900s, and because they have a piece of immortality in them all, the Immortus group is trying to take it away, which turns out they did with Rita back in episode 3. When they took her emotions, they also took her immortality, which makes her start to age up and makes her panic because she's aging, so she tries to look for a bunch of experiments to make herself de-age again, and she finds like this little potion that ends up being a hex, which she drops because Cliff scares her and turns all the Doom Patrol into teenagers, which is classic Doom Patrol because they're just messing everything up like they always do. And it also showed you how old Willoughby is. When he got de-aged, he still looked the same, however his clothes were like medieval clothing, meaning he is old as shit. And it also turns out that the hex will keep de-aging them until they get turned into nothingness. And I love Cliff's quote, "We'll all be jizzified," which is just honestly hilarious, and also just a classic thing Cliff would say. Highly inappropriate, and also pretty accurate. I like how this sends him on a little adventure. They go to try to find someone that Willoughby trusts. However, of course, Cliff and Jane get sidetracked and want to go party with some teenagers. And because of this, and them being teenagers, they set up a lot of character development for Jane as a character. Because Jane never experienced the teenage years. She came after that when her personality was created later on. And I thought it was interesting, this other person with inside Kay, who has never really had that experience before, and she's experiencing being a teenager for the very first time, getting high, getting freaking drunk with a bunch of other people, and really experiencing what it's like to be a teenager that she never got before. And I also like how she ends up tripping out, seeing Kay, and saying, and apologizing for everything she's done in her body, because it's Kay's body, not hers, until Kay tells her, it's our body. It's not just hers, it's our body. Which also means, I think, that Jane is going to slowly start to realize that it's also her body, and that means she can do what she wants in it and not feel bad about doing it because it's Kay. Because Kay has all these other personalities, they technically have it, they all share a body. So it's not just one person's body, it's all of theirs. I find that really interesting because I think Jane has to realize that to really develop as a character, and that's probably also how she'll figure out the puzzle piece, because she'll realize it's her body, she can think about what she wants to do, and it's not just her thinking about her and Kay, she has to think about herself and how she feels, realizing that they're all kind of separate beings and they're not just one collective mind. We also got more development with Vic this episode, because Vic is still remembering his friends. He still wants to go back to what he once was. He sees a bunch of kids hanging out together, thinks about him and his buddies, and he feels bad about it because he kind of missed those times, the time he can't get back with him being Cyborg and everything else. And so he goes to see his friend now as a child and hugs him, which is where we left off with Vic. And I bet you any money he's going to be turned into a baby, because by the end of the episode, Jane gets turned into a baby. And I don't know what's going on with Cliff, because Cliff's still a robot, but with a teenager brain. On top of it, Cliff got way too messed up because he's hurting after everything that's happened to him, especially touching the brain with his hand when he didn't want to touch anything else other than his grandson. Which he's going through a hard time, and I like how when Jane's like, you're gonna go party with a bunch of people other and not your friends, and he's like, well, my friends never asked me how I was doing when I was clearly not doing well. The Doom Patrol does tend not to ask their teammates how they're doing, especially when they're going through something bad. However, they also don't ask for help, so I think it's a two-way street here. Cliff should be asking for help rather than assuming everyone understands what's going on with him. You know, you can't read everyone's minds. No one on this team is a mind reader. They should be talking to each other, communicating, but they don't. But also, they all have their own issues going on, and I think it's going to be a real big thing this season, is each one getting over certain aspects of their lives and their past. Jane needs to find herself. Cliff now needs to figure out how to move past not touching his grandson being the first thing he ever felt. Rita and Madame Rouge need to learn how to forgive each other. And Vic needs to learn how to figure out which life he's going to take. His friends as a civilian or the superhero. Because I don't think he can ever get away from the call of being a superhero. And speaking of Rita and Madame Rouge, they also had a heart-to-heart this episode where Rita misses her friend. She feels betrayed by her, and Madame Rouge apologizes for hurting her. Because of everything that happened last season, and the betrayals, and everything else, they were good friends, and now they're not. So I think this is also going to be them this season growing back together and being good friends once again after they find a way to move past all the betrayal that happened before. And then lastly, some interesting stuff happens at the end of the episode with Willoughby, because his knights come back with that little rabbit. The rabbit blows some smoke in his face or powder or some shit, and he turns back into his regular aged person. However, he wants to go to Jane, and Jane's like, yeah, no, and starts running away but gets turned into a baby. And the magic rabbit goes over to her, has purple eyes, and starts sucking something out of her, which partially makes me really think that the rabbit might be working with the Immortus. Even though they're the ones that warned about the prophecy coming true and Immortus will rise, part of me feels like either the rabbit is working with them secretly, or the rabbit is taking that immortality out of Jane so that Immortus can't get it. And that might be the trend now, that it's either going to be the rabbit or Immortus who are going to be taking each and every one's immortality, so that while Immortus can be risen, or Immortus cannot be risen. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward because of this. And I think next episode Immortus will rise, because it is the mid-season final, and then Titans will be back. Either that or something drastic will happen that'll set us on a cliffhanger until we get the season returning again, which I'm assuming it returns after Titans finishes. But we will see. What did you think about this episode of Doom Patrol, and what do you think is going to happen? Do you think the rabbit is taking Jane's immortality, Or do you think he's doing something more sinister? Let me know down in the comments, because I'm interested to hearing your thoughts. And if you like this video, hit the subscribe button for more, because I will be covering this show until it ends, and then Titans does come back in a couple weeks, and I'll be covering that as well. And if you like this video, hit the like button, it helps out the channel a lot. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.